My name is Chris McCaffrey, and I'm a junior studying history and English at Hillsdale College, and I'm here to introduce Mr. Fred Siegel. Fred Siegel is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the scholar in residence at St. Francis College in Brooklyn. He is a contributing editor to City Journal and has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and a professor at the Sorbonne and the Cooper Union for Science and Art. Mr. Siegel was a senior advisor to Rudy Giuliani's 1993 mayoral campaign. He has written for numerous publications, including the Claremont Review of Books, The Public Interest, Commentary, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Weekly Standard, and The Washington Post. He is the author of numerous books, including The Future Once Happened Here, New York, D.C., L.A., and the Fate of America's Big Cities, The Prince of the City, Giuliani, New York, and the Genius of American Life, and, most recently, The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Fred Siegel.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here at Hillsdale. I've never been here before, and I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. We were all hoping that Bret Stephens would be here tonight. Unfortunately, I can't promise I'll be as interesting as Bret, who's just, as you know, is just terrific. I want to talk tonight about Henry Mencken, H.L. Mencken. Some of you will know who he is, some of the younger people won't. Let me just say to people who don't know who he is, he was enormously consequential. He was the most influential intellectual figure of the 1920s. He dominated the 1920s. And I'll talk a good deal about Mencken. The argument you'll see me make here is that Mencken is alive today, that Mencken has had enormous and profound influence, but not, I suspect, where you would assume. I would argue that H.L. Mencken, the curmudgeonly Mr. Mencken, is the very intellectual fount of contemporary liberalism, and I'll explain. Before I do that, I should point out that Hillsdale is one of the few colleges I've been to where H.L. Mencken is still taught. John Miller, I don't know if John's in the audience tonight, professor of journalism, has his students read Mencken, which I think is just marvelous. There are two ways of thinking about Mencken. One is on the basis of how Mencken sounds. Those of you who read him will know what I mean. And the second way is the substance of Mencken. What I'm going to try to explain is how both those people who emphasize his sound and those people who emphasize his substance have gotten him wrong. The often astute literary critic Joseph Epstein, who was mentioned this afternoon, recently wrote that his one contribution to the English language was his creation of the term virtuecrat. Virtuecrat is a synonym for liberal. A virtuecrat is a synonym for someone who thinks that by thinking good things, their acts are locutionary, therefore they have done good things. So a liberal is you're not liberal by virtue of what you do, but liberal by virtue of what positions you take. To buttress his point, Epstein quoted from the famous French brothers of the 19th century, the Goncourts. And this is what they said. They said, literary arguments are over who has better taste. Arguments about art involve who has the better eye. But every political argument boils down to this: I am better than you are. The American, he's only an American in peculiar ways, who brought that style of thinking to these shores was H.L. Mencken. You'll be surprised to know that the famed journalist who coined the terms Bible Belt and bourgeoisie was one of the founts of modern liberalism. He was, as he crowed to all who would listen, a very superior person. And he said this in many ways, many times. The self-educated Mencken expressed himself through a vast vocabulary. And the very sound of his writings are a pleasure. But the sheer volume of his publication has assured that he's still read to the current day. He stopped writing in 1949, he had a stroke, died in 1956. In 1977, 3 volumes of his letters were published. 3 volumes. In 1987, other letters were published. In 1990, his diaries were published. The diaries caused us something of a sensation, because Mencken, who was strongly against lynching, and Mencken, who called for the Jews of Europe to be brought to America, engaged in certain kinds of petty social anti-Semitism and racism in his diaries. This was a tempest in a teapot. In 2010, the Library of America republished his Prejudices. The Prejudices were the collection of the articles, the short columns that he wrote that he was best known for. That was 1,222 pages, and it wasn't inclusive. In 2014, his 3 volumes of autobiography were reissued, with an additional 200 pages of unpublished material. The man literally didn't have a thought that went unrecorded or unwritten. He wrote about 30 letters a day, in addition to all his other writing. And here's Mencken, who loved to insult his audience. So long as there are men in the world, he clowned, 99% of them will be idiots. The mob man, who I describe as the bubus Americanus, must believe in something, and it must be something indubitably not true. The one thing he can't get down is a fact. Now, the problem with that is that when Mencken came to write about the Scopes trial, he got most of his facts wrong. And I'll come back to that. His writing on Scopes, though widely accepted by liberals, were that of a fabulist. And I would recommend to you, anyone who's interested in the Scopes trial, a book by a man named Edward Larson called Summer for the Gods. It's a brilliant historical account of what happened in Dayton, Tennessee. Contemporary journalists deploy his marvelous one-offs, like his famous quote, "No one ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American voter." The Jonathan Gruber affair, however, suggests that the clever phrase is well wide of the mark. The American voter wasn't fooled by the Obamacare melee. The only people who were fooled by it were Gruber's fellow academics. So today there are 2 kinds of thinkers who write about the sage of Baltimore. Those who write about his sound and those who write about his substance. There are those like the essayist Joseph Epstein, who 30 years ago, I hope he's changed his mind, found Menckens' assault on platitudes and platitudinarians, a wonderful Mencken word, platitudinarians, entertaining. Epstein asked who at Mencken could refer to cliches as, quote, the old wheezing of a melodeon. Melodeon is an old-fashioned accordion. Or refer to hot dogs as cartridges filled with the sweepings of the abattoir, the slaughterhouse. Or to college teachers as the average drover of undergraduates. Menckens' unmistakable prose had, said Epstein, a fine writer himself, an orchestral power. I agree with that. Based on strong verbs, exotic nouns, outrageous adjectives, and a confident cadence, as well as wide learning. The influential critic Alfred Kazin, who some of you have heard of, also taken by the sound of Menckens' prose, suggested less charitably that it resembled not an orchestra, but W.C. Fields playing the tuba. Mencken dismissed opinions he despised, and they were numerous. Here are some of the phrases he used. Bunkum, bosh, tosh, balderdash, blather, blog, pother, rhodomontade, and on. When you read Mencken, you better have a dictionary at hand. Mencken memorably described the writing style of the famed early 20th century economist Thorstein Veblen as, quote, a relentless disease, a sort of progressive intellectual diabetes. It's this last phrase I like, a leprosy of the horse sense. In a more contemporary essay on Mencken, written by Russell Baker, who you remember as the humorist for the Times, now retired, The title of the piece that Baker wrote was called "A Genius for Contempt." Baker wrote, "Much of the pleasure of reading Mencken comes from the burble of his words, even when the content is trivial or annoying. And of course, most of the time, Mencken is doing his best to be annoying to someone. For all those who luxuriate in the furrows of Mencken's dithyrambic denunciations of democracy," that's my phrase, but it's a tribute to Mencken, dithyrambic denunciations of democracy, and the peasants and yokels. He loved to refer to American people as peasants and yokels. There are those who are taken not with the sound, but the substance of Mencken's writing. And there was, despite all the furor and splash, considerable substance. Mencken remains a fugleman, one of his favorite terms, fugleman, model, for philosophical free marketeers who tend to look beyond his amusing animate versions to the Nietzschean core of his writings, referring here to the German philosopher Nietzsche. Still, even they avert their gaze from the full impact of Mencken's Germanophilia. Mencken wrote the first book on Nietzsche published on these shores, 1908. The book was more than exposition. It was, notes Mencken biographer Terry Teachout, and I should say on this, since 2000 alone, 4 biographies of Mencken have been written. That doesn't count the many biographies that were written before 2000. That's how large a figure he was and continues to be. The book was more than exposition, notes Mencken biographer Terry Teachout. It was autobiography in disguise. And I'll come back to that theme. Sometimes when Mencken is writing about Nietzsche, he's really writing about himself. And by the way, this is just an aside, Mencken was a distant cousin of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who created the modern German empire, the modern German state. Now, let me stop here for a second. The period Mencken lives in is the period of the War of English Succession. You've never heard that phrase. What I'm referring to here is, it was clear by the end of the 19th century that England was in relative decline. It was in relative decline compared to Germany and the United States. That the age of English empire was beginning to fade. And so the great question at hand was, who would succeed England as the dominant power? The Germans thought they should succeed. The Americans didn't think about this at all. Like many of Mencken's admirers, Joseph Epstein describes Mencken as having been harassed during World War I for being insufficiently patriotic. But that defies the facts. Mencken was a German nationalist, and as such both a paladin of anti-Americanism and a champion of the Kaiser's armies in World War I. I'll come back to that. Mencken's Nietzschean writings on World War I on behalf of Imperial Germany have been ignored by the enthusiasts of both his sound and of his substance. You rarely see reference to them. Opposed to American intervention in the Great War on the side of the Allies, Mencken had no objection to war per se. Drawing on Nietzsche's conception of the will to power, he wrote, "War is a good thing because it is honest. It admits the central fact of human nature. A nation too long at peace becomes a sort of gigantic old maid." What Mencken opposed were British and American attempts to restrain German militarism, not war per se, as his apologists would have it. The war, notes Mencken biographer Fred Hobson, focused his thoughts and created a clear position. Here's Mencken. 1914. I too, like the leaders of Germany, had grave doubts about democracy. It suddenly dawned on me, somewhat to my surprise, he's being disingenuous here, that the whole body of doctrine that I've been preaching was fundamentally anti-Anglo-Saxon, and that if I had any spiritual home, it must be in the land of my ancestors. When World War I started, I began forthwith to whoop it up for the Kaiser. And I kept up that woofing so long as there was any free speech left. And he refers here to the repression of World War I. Now, when most people try to give you an account of liberalism, they either refer to progressivism or the New Deal. In a book I wrote, Revolt Against the Masses, which I have copies outside, I'd be delighted to sign, I try to show that modern liberalism culturally was created neither by progressivism nor by the New Deal, but was created in the aftermath of World War I, in a response in part to Woodrow Wilson's repressions during World War I. When you couldn't speak German, where sauerkraut had to be talked of as liberty cabbage, and so on and so forth. In 1914, before the U.S. entered World War I, Mencken wrote, this is the title of the essay, "The Mailed Fist, the Armored Fist, and its Prophet." The prophet being Nietzsche, in which he presented Germany as a model for the United States. Now, Mencken argues that in the 1870s, Nietzsche was right to mock Germany. But when you read Mencken on Nietzsche in Germany in the 1870s, you realize Mencken is actually writing about himself in America in the teens and 20s. So here's what he says about Nietzsche in Germany in the 70s. "No epithet from Nietzsche was too outrageous. No charge was too far-fetched. No manipulation or interpretation of evidence was too daring to enter into his ferocious indictment. He accused the Germans, substitute Americans, of stupidity, superstitiousness, silliness, of a chronic weakness of will for dodging the issues, a fatuous barnyard and green grazing contentment, clumsy and unintelligent government, and worse yet, he argued, Germany was guilty of a slavish devotion to Christianity, a spiritual dyspepsia, and a puerile mysticism." This is Mencken. This is Mencken on America. And he sees this in Nietzsche's writings about Germany in the 1870s. You'll see in a second why this is significant. If I go around the bend and I hear someone hitting the floor, I'll stop. But according to Mencken, by 1892, when Nietzsche wrote his masterpiece, Thus Spake Zarathustra, an enormous change had come over the German scene. Vast new energies had been unleashed, not by the old Junker aristocracy of the barracks and the court, but by a new aristocracy of the laboratory, the study, and the shop. Germany had surged, he argued, to the forefront of the world. This is what Mencken wanted for America. An aristocracy of experts, shorthand. Germany, insisted Mencken, had transcended the Anglo-Saxon world. This new Germany, he said, was a democracy, but not like American democracy. It wasn't founded on the romantic theory that all men were equal. I'm quoting Mencken now. It was free of the taint of mobocracy, Mencken's name for democracy. It was empty of soothing and windy phrases. On the contrary, it was the delimited aristocratic democracy in the Athenian sense, the democracy of intelligence and strength, of superior fitness. And it created a superbly efficient ruling caste. That's what Mencken wanted for America. And I won't go into it now, but I talked about how in the 1920s, other strands of liberalism wanted the exact same thing. So while political liberalism was created by Woodrow Wilson, by the New Deal, cultural liberalism, the libido of liberalism, was created in these years right after World War I by Mencken and others who rebelled against Wilsonianism during World War I. The new Germany, he said, had taken what had been the haughtiness of a single class, the Junkers, and turned it into a haughtiness of an entire people. World War I, as Mencken saw it, was the culmination of Germany's Nietzschean-inspired ascent to power. To prove his point, Mencken quoted Zarathustra. Bear with me, this is the one long quote. This is from Nietzsche, 1892. I do not advise you to compromise and make peace, but to conquer. Let your labor be fighting and your peace victory. What is good? Good is all that increases the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power is increasing, that resistance is being overcome. Not contentment, but more power. Not peace at any price, but war. Not virtue, but efficiency. The weak and the botched must perish. The weak and the botched must perish. That is the first principle of our humanity, and they should be helped to perish. I am writing for the lords of the earth. This is Nietzsche. Now, this strain of thinking is not peculiar to Nietzsche or Mencken. I'm sure you've all read H.G. Wells, no matter your age. Some of you read Wells' Outline of History. Some of you read The Invisible Man, his science fiction fantasy, but you've all read H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was a great eugenicist. He too wanted the weak to perish. Liberalism is not what people assume it is. Liberalism had its strong strains of social Darwinism and eugenics. Two elements I won't get into tonight. But what I will get into is the idea of a superior caste, of a ruling aristocracy that should run the country. And here I'm sure some of you are anticipating Jonathan Gruber. Thus concluded Mencken, writing about Zarathustra, with Germany's armies on the march in 1914, Germany becomes Nietzsche, Nietzsche becomes Germany. Mencken cheered on the sinking of the British ocean liner, the Lusitania, by German submarines, a sinking in which 128 Americans lost their lives. He applauded this in print. He was a courageous man, if nothing else. He dismissed the slaughter in Belgium as beneath his concerns, while writing about the greatness of the Kaiser and Germany's general Emil Ludendorff. And during the war, Ludendorff became, in effect, the leader, the de facto president, Kaiser of Germany. In another of his Atlantic essays, he wrote about the authoritarian genius of Ludendorff in fighting a Nietzschean war, and made it clear that Mencken's concerns for freedom were secreted when he was presented with what he saw as beautiful authority. Now, I'm not going to talk tonight at all about the 1930s, communism, but liberals of the 30s also thought they saw a beautiful authority in Stalinism. Mencken thought he saw in the Kaiser and Ludendorff a beautiful authority that deserved to be obeyed. The essay on Ludendorff counseled that what Mencken wanted was not so much freedom so that the citizen wouldn't be subject to arbitrary authority, but rather freedom because he didn't want the Übermenschen, the overman, to be constrained by ordinary people. He liked unregulated capitalism not because it gives the poor a chance to rise, because it allowed the superior men to have their way unobtruded. Now, here's an irony. Mencken, who was a strong opponent of censorship, and courageous at times, opponent of censorship, was saved by an act of self-censorship. He wrote an essay called, the title of the essay was, After Germany's Conquest of the United States. Now, the only reason we know this essay exists is because of letters between Mencken and the Atlantic. It was withdrawn from publication. Now, what's odd about this is Mencken published every stray thought he'd ever had. This he withdrew from publication, and it saved him. And I say this with some certainty. His papers are at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. I spent time there. I spent time with the curator, and I try to track down, is there an existing copy? There may be an existing copy of this, but he couldn't find it, and I certainly couldn't find it. So now we jump to the origins of liberalism. The cultural origins of American liberalism were rooted in the early 1920s, when Mencken, his close colleague Sinclair Lewis, I'm just curious, how many people have read Sinclair Lewis's Main Street? How many people under 50 have read Sinclair Lewis's Main Street? 1, 2, 3, 4. You need to read Main Street, not because it's a good read or it's because it's a good novel. It's neither, but because it's so seminal. It was a political earthquake and described as such at the time. The early 20s were described by Alfred Kazin as the age of Mencken, when the clowning curmudgeon expressed better than his peers the post-war disillusionment with Woodrow Wilson in particular, and America in general. The post-war writers like Edmund Wilson, the heirs of Randolph Bourne, who unfortunately perished in World War I, were critical not of Germany in World War I, they were critical of American democracy. They blamed American democracy for the war. These writers I'm referring to, the writers who defined liberalism in the early 20s, these writers wrote Malcolm Cowley, who was the chronicler of this generation, quote, seized power in the literary world almost like the Bolsheviks in Russia. That's exactly right. I'm thinking of, you've all read F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, Edmund Wilson, and on and on. This generation defined American letters then and ever since. But Mencken's article been published about the desirability of the German conquest of America. It's hard to imagine that even the politically tone-deaf literary critic Edmund Wilson would have insisted in 1921 that, quote, Mencken is the civilized conscience of modern America. Wilson wasn't alone. The New York Times thought him the most powerful private citizen in the country. He was beloved by campus newspapers, the campus smart set. One college newspaper called him the guiding light of undergraduates. That says a lot about undergraduates. In 1926, Walter Lippmann called him the most powerful personal influence on this whole generation of educated people. But Lippmann shrewdly went on to note that Mencken often couldn't tell the difference between ignorance and evil. Mencken created a liberal demonology out of the Scopes trial. It lives with us today. The play Inherit the Wind, supposedly based on the Scopes trial, is based on Frederick Lewis Allen's account of the Scopes trial, which was based on Mencken's account. So we have Mencken's fabulous account, Frederick Lewis Allen's account, and then the play. And what we end up in the contemporary world is no idea what actually happened at the Scopes trial. The trial, you might be surprised to learn, was initiated by the ACLU, looking for a test case, looking for a way to put itself on the map. It had only been founded a few years earlier. It was not founded by the locals, as Mencken suggested, nor were the locals the mean-spirited boobs he depicted. The locals supported the trial as a matter of boosterism for their town of Dayton, Tennessee. No one had ever heard of Dayton, Tennessee, and they never heard about it again. And the idea was this was going to put the town on the map. It would draw all sorts of reporters, all sorts of interest. It did, but not in the right way. Scopes was well treated and well liked by the people Mencken described as cretins. And the supposedly buffoonish William Jennings Bryan, quote, Mencken, the idol of morondom, was a well-read world traveler who had debated Darwin's Origins of Species with Henry Fairfield Osborn, the president of the Museum of Natural History. Bryan was indeed completely wrong about evolution, but his criticism of the social Darwinism Mencken subscribed to was to prove prescient with the coming of the Nazis. When Bryan died suddenly after the trial, Mencken gloated, quote, "We killed the son of a bitch. He wasn't a nice man." In 1926, the year after the Scopes trial, Mencken published a book he had been working on for many years. It was titled Notes on Democracy. It proved an embarrassment to most, with the exception of the Kaiser, who sent a note from his exile in the Netherlands praising the book. A government by yokels was, Mencken argued, sure to be a scandal and a farce. The U.S., he said, is such a scandal and such a farce. Democracy, Mencken explained for the umpteenth, but far from the last time, was a conspiracy against the superior men. The superior men had a monopoly, he said, of higher virtues, of the higher virtues. But Mencken's efforts demonstrated that on the subject of democracy, as opposed to his own 3 volumes of autobiography, Mencken at full length was far less compelling than in his intentionally comic columns. In his columns, his crotches were hidden by his descriptions of histrionic preachers, preachy presidents, overwrought golf enthusiasts, political poltroonery. That's one of his favorite terms, poltroonery or poltroons. A poltroon is a political lowlife, a political hack, an operator. Shelley Silver. A friend sighed that he wished Mencken hadn't written the book because it reveals too much about him. Carried along by the animus to the anti-alcoholists, the Prohibitionists. By the way, I don't know how many people realize that the Prohibitionists were by and large left-wing. The Socialist Party supported Prohibition. The Progressives supported Prohibition. Prohibition was not, as you get in modern demonology. With postmodernism, it's really not any reason to talk about academia substantively, except at a few places like Hillsdale. But Prohibition is not what you think it was. It was a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake of the right-wing bourgeoisie in Mencken's terms. Mencken's star ascended to the heavens in the 1920s, but it descended rapidly in the 1930s, when his disdain for FDR and indifference to the suffering of the Depression cast a shadow over his once incendiary wordplay. Mencken's inability to describe Hitler as more than, quote, a preposterous mountebank and a second-rate Klansman hurt him in his public standing. Mencken, along with Sinclair Lewis, not only the author of Main Street, Babbitt, and Elmer Gantry, but another book that if you haven't read, it's worth reading. It's a book called It Can't Happen Here. It's reissued every few years. Paul Krugman refers to it. During the Bush years, he kept on suggesting that it can happen here. In other words, fascism will come to America. The bizarre thing about it can't happen here, that the fascists in America were the members of the Rotary Club. How many people have been to a Rotary Club meeting? Can anyone think of anyone less like a fascist? Now, Rotary Club meetings might be boring when they're talking about how to raise money for muscular dystrophy. But fascism? Sinclair Lewis didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about. Lewis conceived of homegrown fascism as the expression of the Rotary Club run amok. Similarly, Mencken seemed to think that Hitler was merely Babbitt run amok. In the 1920s, Mencken was considered a leftist, yet without changing a jot or a tittle to his views, in the 1930s he was declaimed as a rightist. What was continuous was his disdain for democracy and the American middle class, that is, the bourgeoisie. The diaries Mencken began to write while politically embittered in the 1930s were defamed when published in the 1990s for their supposedly racist and anti-Semitic jibes. They allowed the politically correct to mock him as a beer-swilling bigot, a hypochondriac, and a small-town mama's boy. He was all of those things. He was also a brilliant writer. But what redeemed him for liberals was his hostility to the boobs, censorship, Christianity in America. In 1990, when after 25 years under lock and key, the diaries were published, The arch-liberal John Kenneth Galbraith, JKG, who had his own doubts about democracy. When those diaries were published, Galbraith felt compelled to defend Mencken, and not just JKG. Louis Auchincloss, the biographer, among other things, of Walter Lippmann, the great Ralph Ellison, John Hersey, Norman Mailer, Arthur Miller, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., William Styron, Kurt Vonnegut, a not unimportant set of writers, felt compelled to come to Mencken's defense. Mencken received a similarly stentorian defense in academia, although in his own time he had mocked professors as priestly pedants. What was this about? I'll come to that. On April 13, 1945, noted Galbraith, the day after FDR's death, Mencken quipped in his characteristic style, FDR had every quality that morons esteem in their heroes. Thus, the demigod seems to be in the making. But, wrote John Kenneth Galbraith, here's the problem. Today, the most ardent supporters of FDR, and one trusts of racial tolerance and decency, regularly turn up as the most devoted admirers and defenders of Henry Mencken. Why? Why were so many liberals enthused about Mencken, since Mencken had nothing but disdain for FDR and the New Deal, which they adored? The first thing that should come to mind is the very terms left and right don't mean a lot. I'll come back to that. Here's Galbraith. What those who read him long ago remember was wonderfully explosive, liberating attack on the conventional, stuffy world. What he said was perhaps sometimes wrong, but he made us believe that you could take on established viewpoints. What he said about Roosevelt released us to say what we wanted to say about Herbert Hoover and William Randolph Hearst. The Mencken liberation, this is Galbraith again, if greatly different as the target, was closely akin to that of Thorstein Veblen. I'm sure Galbraith hadn't read Mencken's mockery of Veblen. Leave aside Mencken's mockery of Veblen's nearly impenetrable prose style. I don't recommend reading Veblen unless you want to abuse yourself. Galbraith's account, to use one of Mencken's favorite words, is balderdash. Surely Galbraith doesn't mean to suggest that Hoover and Hearst hadn't already come under withering fire from the New Republic, The Nation, and the New York Post, among other publications. They had. He's making absolutely no sense. Galbraith comes closer to the mark when he explains, quote, I have cited perhaps 100 times his definition of conscious, Mencken's definition of conscious, is, quote, that inner voice that warns us someone might be looking. It's a good line. Whatever Mencken's prejudices, the word Mencken himself used to describe his essays, he was, said Galbraith, a tremendous liberating force. But more important, though Galbraith never had Mencken's honesty on the subject, was that, like Mencken, Galbraith believed, although for different reasons, in government by superior men. And he, Galbraith, was very sure that he was one of those superior men. And here we come to the gravamen of the issue. Despite Mencken's love for the Kaiser, whose autographed picture hung in Mencken's bedroom, signed by the Kaiser, quote, in appreciation for the mailed fist and its prophet, despite Mencken's sometimes casual racial aspersions and hostility to active government. The same man, much beloved by today's libertarians and conservatives, did more, save his close contemporary Sinclair Lewis, to create the cultural foundations of contemporary liberalism than any other individual. Let me repeat that. Mencken and Lewis are the cultural founts of contemporary liberalism. Mencken's style and the substance of his disdain for the workaday American so permeated post-World War II liberal culture It's impossible to imagine it without his influence. Take Dwight MacDonald. Some of you, no doubt, have read Dwight MacDonald. He's a wonderful, I knew Dwight, he was a wonderful writer. He couldn't think straight, but he was wonderful, had a wonderful wit. Like Mencken, MacDonald was never able to come to grips with Hitler or anti-Semitism. He wanted the United States to remain neutral in World War II. He became one of the most influential left-wing journalists, intellectuals after World War II, did MacDonald. Europe, explained MacDonald, has its Hitlers, but we have our Rotarians. He's hearkening back here to Sinclair Lewis, it can't happen here. MacDonald wrote about Henry Wallace, the communist-backed candidate for the Progressive Party in 1948, and a few of you are old enough to remember this. He really hit it. Because when MacDonald wrote about Henry Wallace, he sounded like Mencken and Coolidge and Harding. And here's Dwight MacDonald. Wallace, for those of you who don't know, was the de facto candidate of the Communist Party in the 1948 elections. 1948 elections had 4 candidates: Harry Truman, Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York, Strom Thurmond, and Henry Wallace. Strom Thurmond ran as the Dixiecrat. Henry Wallace ran as the leader of the Progressive Party. And to put this into perspective, George McGovern adored Henry Wallace. Well, let's go back to 1948. Quote, Wallace Land is the mental habitat of Henry Wallace, plus a few 100,000 regular readers of the New Republic, The Nation, and then a newspaper that no longer exists called PM. It is a region of perpetual verbal fogs, caused by the warm winds of the liberal Gulf Stream coming into contact with the Soviet glacier. Its natives speak Wallacese, a debased provincial dialect. Anthony Lewis, some of you must no doubt remember Anthony Lewis, for 25 years a columnist at the New York Times. Lewis was a self-proclaimed socialist, although he admitted socialism didn't work. It didn't matter. He still supported it. Anthony Lewis, columnist for the New York Times, I think from 1978 to 2003. Anthony Lewis had described Mencken as a personal god. In the 50s, the liberal standard-bearer John Kenneth Galbraith melded political statism with cultural Menckenism by mocking free market economics and the Christian mores of Main Street as the conventional wisdom. Like HLM, JKG developed a rhetorical device which passed itself off as an understanding of society. More importantly, for would-be intellectuals growing up in the 50s, suffocated as they saw it by phony adults, Mencken was the anticipation of J.D. Salinger, the anticipation of Holden Caulfield. Any of you young people haven't read A Catcher in the Rye? You need to read it so you can understand your parents. Now, Richard Hofstadter, Columbia historian, twice Pulitzer Prize winner, was sometimes known as the second Mencken. I won't go into details as to why he's the second Mencken. Suffice it to say, there's an appendix in the upcoming paperback edition of Revolt Against the Masses, which is about Hofstadter as the second Mencken. But Mencken wrote a very famous essay, Hofstadter wrote a very famous essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. I'm curious, undergraduates, how many of you read The Paranoid Style in American Politics? So a fair number of you have read it. It's an enormously important essay. What Hofstadter did is what Mencken did. He turned political categories into psychological categories. So he demeaned Goldwater supporters as head cases. He allowed, and Hofstadter, like Mencken, was a fine writer, he allowed the work of style to do the work of substance. If you're a little older and you haven't read The Paranoid Style, read it. Because I can guarantee you every journalist I know in Washington has read The Paranoid Style and has quoted it at least 3 or 4 times in his life, albeit quoted it mistakenly. because Hofstadter wrote it in 1965. By the end of the 60s, Hofstadter had changed his mind. What happened was the Columbia campus had been taken over by SDSers. And lo and behold, Hofstadter discovered that people who were psychologically problematic were on the left as well as the right. He was stunned. In the late 1960s, Norman Mailer appropriated the Menckenian trope to write off the regular folk as the wad. In 1978, Nicholas von Hoffman, the libertarian new leftist, wrote a book called Make-Believe Presidents, Illusions of Power from McKinley to Carter, which updated Mencken's accounts of presidents since Grover Cleveland as bastards, boodlers, and blackguards. Today, Mencken's assumptions have been so widely internalized among liberals, there's no need to name Mencken. When the editor of Slate, does everyone know that online magazine, Slate? When the editor of Slate, disturbed by criticism of President Obama, wrote an article entitled "Down with the People." Or when MIT professor Jonathan Gruber was caught on tape bragging about stupidity of the American people. It's that stupidity, he said, which allowed Washington to sell the American people Obamacare. But of course, they didn't sell Obamacare. It wasn't sold. Harvard professors, however, were enraged when they discovered that their premiums were going up by a few $100s. Judging by the 2014 election returns, it was not the public, but Gruber's fellow academics who were deceived. More recently, Daily Beast writer Michael Tomasky and an LA Times columnist Michael Hiltzik explained that the public's failures to embrace the glories of Obamacare was due to the intellectual inadequacies of the American people. Then again, if you believe these two columnists, you believe Obama's former pastor, Reverend Wright, that the problem in the inner city is the problem of middle-class mindedness. The problem in Detroit, if you didn't know it, was people are too middle-class minded. That's positively bizarre. Mencken's great achievement is that he taught successive generations of American liberals how to be narrow-minded while projecting an air of superiority. Let me repeat that because it's the core of his continuing influence. How to be narrow-minded while projecting projecting an air of superiority. The writers who hailed the sound of Mencken's writings missed his Germanophilia and Nietzscheanism. The libertarians grasped Nietzscheanism, but failed to see that Mencken's ideal was a statism of sorts in which superior men like himself ran the show. Liberals like Galbraith, hailed by academia, came the closest to continuing the spirit of Mencken's anti-Americanism, but only after they brushed aside his deep disdain for the New Deal. Last paragraph. Ironically, Mencken, the iconoclast, has had his attitudes adopted by the priestly caste that wants to shame and rule us today. 60 years after his death, H.L. Mencken is a continuing, albeit malign, influence on American politics and culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel. After the Q&A session, we'll have a book signing. Mr. Siegel has agreed to sign his newer book, The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. And those will be available just over here by the stairways. Please raise your hand, and we have a few minutes for questions. Looks like we have one starting in the back, and then we'll come forward.
Sir, thank you very much for your time today. I want to go back towards the end of your speech where you talked about how Mencken helped make people on the left a little more narrow-minded. My question goes to how do we as conservatives in the journalism spectrum actually go towards responding to that from a perspective that's going to be convincing towards the majority of America? Thank you, sir.
I think you should work on something refreshing, evidence-based journalism. I think if you base your journalism on evidence, you'll convince people of your arguments. If the evidence if it supplies a convincing argument, it will supply a convincing basis for the public to follow those arguments. There's no substitute for evidence. You know, people forget that all of Obama's, how should we describe it, lying about Obamacare was all visible in 2010. It was there in congressional hearings. It was there in articles written about it. It wasn't picked up. But over time, the facts came to the fore, and that's generally what happens. Just give you a brief example of this. For reasons I won't go into, I follow events in Yemen. There's no good reason to do that. It's a bizarre place. What's called north and south there is actually west and east, but nothing makes sense in Yemen. There's no water. 4 months ago, the president announced Yemen was a great tactical success. Yemen is falling apart right now. Evidence comes to the fore, sometimes too slowly, as in the case of Benghazi, but it does come to the fore. Everyone agrees with everything I said?
I was just wondering what evidence there is that the articles Mencken wrote on Nietzsche were him about the Americans and America.
Yeah. First of all, I would suggest you read The Male Fist and Its Prophet. It's readily available just online at the Atlantic. It's clear when Mencken is writing about Nietzsche, he's actually writing about himself. The book on Nietzsche was autobiographical. The essay is autobiographical. So when he uses the same phrase, he puts the same phrases in Nietzsche's mouth that he Mencken has used himself in other articles, we can draw the conclusion that he's using Nietzsche to advance his own views, which are not so different because it's complicated because he's in part formed by Nietzsche.
Yes, my question
Please
is,
stand
can you
up.
explain a little more how
Please stand up.
Can you explain a little further how the publication of Menckens Diaries revived his reputation? I wasn't quite clear on that.
I don't think it. I hope that didn't come across the way. It's not so much it revived as continued his reputation. He wrote so much, and he purposely planned that every 20 years or so, an additional trove of his writings would be released. He literally wrote 16 hours a day. He wrote 30 letters a day. How could you possibly do that? So there are 3 sets of letters released in the 70s. Then 1990, the diaries are released. The only reason the diaries produced a kerfuffle is because they weren't politically correct. And whatever you want to say about Mencken, he wasn't politically correct. And so he wasn't an anti-Semite. He wanted FDR to rescue the German Jews. He wasn't a racist. He was a vehement critic of lynching. There was a lynching on the eastern shore of Maryland in the 20s. He wrote about it brilliantly. I mean, I think Mencken was a malevolent influence, but he wasn't a racist or an anti-Semite. He was just sharp-tongued. But the diaries produced this backlash. And so Galbraith and all these other authors felt compelled to rush to his defense. But it didn't revive his reputation. His reputation really never went away. It continued. I mentioned Paul Krugman before. Krugman did 2 or 3 columns on Mencken-esque themes by way of Sinclair Lewis. It can't happen here. The Rotary is marching again. You know, George Bush is leading us in the direction of dictatorship. It's too stupid to be believed. but it speaks to a continued influence.
You mentioned that prohibition back then, over here.
Sorry.
You mentioned that prohibition back then was left-wing, and you're looking for someone to disagree with you. So I just want to observe that academic dean of Hillsdale College, E. Harold Munn, who many of the older folks may remember, ran for president in the United States on the prohibition ticket 4 times back in the, and by then it was certainly not left-wing. I just wonder what happened.
I think you're right. The Prohibition in 1919 was a cause pushed by progressives and left-wingers, and it was a straightforward reason. Too many working men drank their salaries. Would go from anyone's been in Pittsburgh would know exactly what I'm talking about. The steel mills are along the water, the bars are 1 street away, and then the homes are up the hill. And so it wasn't Blue Nose, it wasn't prudes who were pushing this. People were worried that working men were losing their salaries and sending their families into poverty. It wasn't as odd as it would later come to seem. It became a conservative cause, but that's a little later. I didn't know, by the way, the president of Hillsdale ran for president.
I have a family anecdote involving Mencken, and I hope you can provide additional context. My grandfather, who was a doctor, committed suicide in 1938 because Mencken had published 2 articles that he wrote in the May and September 1934 editions of the American Mercury. He wrote those articles under the pseudonym of George W. Aspinwall, and in them he advocated publicly supported medical care. As I said, he himself was a doctor, and because he was an ENT, his business was totally by referral. Mencken promised not to release his name, but he did anyway, and the result was that my grandfather's medical practice pretty much disappeared. So he was a casualty of Mencken's arrogance, I would suggest. I wondered if you could if you can provide any more information about the American Mercury. Perhaps you know about that incident.
I don't know about the incident, but Mencken was enormously arrogant. Nothing else if not arrogant. The American Mercury in the 20s attracted a wide spectrum of writers. F. Scott Fitzgerald, for instance, published. Sinclair Lewis wrote for the American Mercury. By the 30s, there's a famous incident. Let me relate the incident. I think you'll see. Mencken is invited to speak at a banquet for FDR, and he, makes it clear he has very little use for FDR. FDR then denounces Mencken. But it's in Mencken's language. It's something Mencken had written about another politician. And Mencken was sorely embarrassed. He never really recovered from this incident. And he became sour and bitter. And the American Mercury suffered as a consequence. And it became less and less reputable. I'm sorry I can't tell you more than that, but by the 30s, it wasn't the publication it had once been. That Mencken did that is obviously despicable. I don't think that's, you can recognize someone's brilliance and their talent, but without thinking them moral or decent or good. I would apply that to Mencken.
We have time for one more question. Look in the back here.
Yes, Mr. Siegel. There was a movie made about 4 or 5 years ago called Alleged, and it was loosely based on the book Summer for the Gods. It depicts Mencken exactly as you described him tonight. I'm wondering if you've heard of that movie. It's It's actually well crafted, but not well known, and it's a refreshing alternative to the lies presented in the other movie you talked about concerning the Scopes trial.
Thank you. I never heard of this movie. I now want to go see it.
I want you to get back to it.
Alleged. No, that's fascinating, because that book, the Edward Larson book, is a magnificent piece of scholarship. Yes?
She was
wow.
in that movie, she said.
Wait,
so.
Could we get a microphone up here? We have an actress.
We've lost all control now. We'll take one more comment, and then we'll end the session, I guess. Here we go.
I urge you to go see it, not because I was in it, because I'm easily forgettable, but it stars Colm Meaney as H.L. Mencken. He's brilliant. And Fred Thompson as William Jennings Bryan. It is a wonderful little film, and this is an example of how the left continues to sway, the Hollywood left continues to sway distribution. Could not get a distributor for it. Could not. It is available, you can rent it, because it does paint a rather unflattering portrait of Mencken.
What was your role in it?
I played Mrs. William Jennings Bryan. I spent all my time in a wheelchair.
Well, thank you very much, and please join me again in thanking Fred Siegel.